Well, hi, I'm Tracy Kajewski-Correa, the director of the StEER network, and I'm pleased to provide this overview that introduces StEER, the Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network. Now, we all know that natural hazards events provide a very critical opportunity to generate knowledge on the performance of the built environment in an affected community. And those field observations that are generated in the second step create a cycle that naturally feeds into continued research and development to address the identified vulnerabilities, and then ultimately proposing new mitigation strategies that commonly are disseminated through our regulatory mechanisms, then eventually reaching our affected communities to close this vital feedback loop. StEER views its role in this process as an opportunity to better coordinate and leverage communities of research, practice, and policy to streamline all of this important work, shown here by the fusion of orange colors overlaid on this traditional cycle, so that we can accelerate the generation of the knowledge and, more importantly, its dissemination back into the affected communities, into communities of research and practice, and even speed pathways toward regulatory implementation through creating vital partnerships across the natural hazards engineering community. Now, understanding where we are positioned within the natural hazards engineering research infrastructure is critical. NARI has an important kernel at the heart of it, which is an experimental kernel fundamentally, but also includes a social impact and field reconnaissance element that StEER naturally aligns with. Now, as you can see here, that particular element links explicitly to one of the NARI elements called Converge. Now, Converge was created as an umbrella under which all the other extreme events reconnaissance and research bodies would be organized, coordinate, and receive support from other vital NARI assets such as the RAPID facility, the Design Safe CI team, and the NCO. And as you can see in this slide, StEER importantly holds a prominent position among EERs in this important work. Now, it's also important to note and to clarify for the viewer here that our National Science Foundation Award will support basic operations of StEER to do this work, and also allow us to engage in some research and development to enhance our offerings for the community, and of course funding to field our teams to deploy for events and collect vital data. But we want to emphasize that although we have funding for this important work, this does not replace things like the RAPID grant program and other proposal opportunities at the National Science Foundation. In fact, the way we view it is that our work as StEER will shine a bright light on areas that are worthy of continued investigation and further investment by NSF. So we hope that we provide an important role to guide people toward how best to use our assets. So the approach that we've adopted for StEER is one that first recognizes that we need to build on what we learned through the vital contributions of some of the earlier organizations like GEAR. And so looking at their model, we decided that we would similarly found our efforts on three important pillars. The first is we wanted to increase the capacity of the community to be able to collect this data and do it in a standardized way. So community-driven standards is one of our core contributions and the training that helps us all be aligned under our common framework. Second, we wanted to improve coordination so that we could more swiftly capture vital perishable data, getting into the field early, being highly efficient in data collection, and thus hopefully very impactful in our responses. And finally, we saw some real opportunities to create novel modes of collaboration within diverse constituencies that are interested in natural hazards events. That's not only the research community, but practitioners and policymakers all benefit from the work that we do. So we'd like to find ways to accelerate the learning from these events to those critical groups. So when StEER does do its work out in the community, the goal for us is to create high quality communal data sets, and that's the key. Our data is communal and open for all to use. And we document the performance of the built environment with other EERs under Converge looking at other aspects. And by creating data that's standardized and shared widely, it is our hope that it's going to be broadly reused by the community. Because we're synthesizing all this collective knowledge, it's not just the data that we produce that's valuable, but a variety of other products that kind of synthesize what we've learned and some of the major findings, which we are also producing and pushing out for others. What also is really attractive and what we enjoy in our role as leadership members with StEER is that we get the opportunity to work across the hazards. So StEER supports all of the hazards traditionally associated with dynamic load effects on structures, from windstorms like hurricanes and tornadoes to earthquakes and phenomenon like storm surge and tsunamis. So a little bit about the origins and genesis of StEER. StEER really began with a pilot, a series of rapid awards that were executed in 2017 for collecting data during Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, a really landmark season. Based on what was learned in those events, NSF was then interested in funding an EAGER award that was rolled out in the late 2018 to allow us to then formalize a lot of the protocols and functionalities that were developed in those pilots and create a template for what would become StEER. Now, NSF was generously supplementing that EAGER award to allow us to begin deploying pretty quickly. In fact, right when Florence land fell, we were able to already start securing funding to push people out and begin prototyping the workflows as we develop them. That implied that all the way through 2020, we were able to respond to events while simultaneously building up our capabilities, our workflows, and the community around this effort. We then moved into 2021 with an offering to NSF to fund what would become StEER 2.0, and that was awarded, bringing us into a new era of operations that allows us to really expand the offerings that StEER is making. This slide shows a quick summary of the responses that we've generated from our inception to the current time. And you can see that we've responded to 43 hazard events. Those have produced 19 event briefings, 32 detailed reports, and amazingly, over 29,000 structural assessments are encompassed in our mobile platform, which is operated through the organization or the company Fulcrum as part of their Fulcrum community platform. So now that you've learned a little bit about the history of the organization, let's dive a little more deeply into the governance model and how we engage our amazing members and community leaders in doing this kind of important work. So with StEER's expansion in this version 2, we are actively expanding our governance model as well. As you can see at the top here, we maintain our original 5 directors who had authored the proposals as investigators on the NSF grants. We're now able to expand their support, but also bring in some new forms of community participation. These include advisory bodies dedicated to our hazards, as well as working groups working on particular areas of emphasis for StEER. Now, these bodies are interfacing with a new entity that will be unveiled soon called our steering committee. And that will have membership that encompasses a representative from each of these advisory bodies, as well as our regional nodes, and at-large membership from the research community. Our regional nodes will cross-cut the United States initially and expand globally, providing important representation for StEER's responses geospatially, where hazards in the different areas where hazards may potentially strike. And our members then will have the opportunity to interface directly through those regional nodes as they participate in StEER's responses to those events. For just a recap on who our leadership is, StEER has a director, myself, Tracy Kajewski-Correa, but then 3 associate directors, Ian, Khalid, and David, who provide important leadership with the 3 hazards that we represent: coastal, seismic or earthquake, and windstorms. David Roosh provides a cross-cutting leadership in developing our data standards and data collection workflows. We were also able, in the expansion offered by NSF in our version 2, to add research associates, and Shafiq and Amir are associated with the Notre Dame and Auburn nodes to support my work and David's in the development of our new operational models. In addition, as I mentioned, we have and are unveiling now our newly formed hazard advisory boards. And these are organized around the 3 primary hazards. Now, as you can see from our org chart, each of the associate directors that corresponds to a given hazard will serve as the chair of the advisory boards linked to them. And you can see the representation here in coastal, earthquake, and windstorms for the individuals who'll be helping to guide StEER and how to better serve these respective communities. The idea here is that not only will they make sure that what we're developing in StEER is a good representation of the needs in the communities they represent, but they will also provide us some high-level advisement during our event responses for hazards that fall under their footprint. And most importantly, they're critical ambassadors for StEER out to the wider hazards community, and hopefully helpful in growing the partnership and participation in our efforts across the country and the world. Now, our members are at the heart of everything we do with StEER, so I wanted to provide an overview of how they participate in our efforts. To date, more than 390 individuals around the world have been approved as StEER members, and over half of them have actually participated in our event responses so far. As you can also see here, over 730 people have enrolled as users in our mobile app suite at Fulcrum. So that shows you that our data collection platform is being engaged well beyond our formal members by people who either want to contribute to or help support data collection in various events. What is important to note is that these people, there's over 400 people that are part of StEER, have really not participated with one another in an event before. So when they form teams, they're coming together in a pseudo ad hoc model. And the way that we're able to actually bring people together despite lacking a prior working relationship has to do with how we standardize our workflows, but also the way we structure our participation. As you can see, we tier our participation. So people participate in StEER as either a virtual assessment structural team or VAST member, or a field assessment structural team or FAST member. Now, VAST members do not go to the field. They are only virtual in their response. And therefore, at any level of experience, you can be on a VAST team and participate in an event. If you want to go out to the field to collect data, then you must have some minimal experience in responding to these events. And if you are one of our StEER level 2, somebody with just a beginner's experience in field work, we will allow you to deploy to the field on a FAST team as a trainee. Our level 3 and 4 are the more seasoned members of StEER who would be the primary folks on the field assessment teams, with a level 4 being the leaders of those teams. Our working groups are open to any individual at levels 3 or 4, and the steering committee is going to be driven largely by our level 4 leaders. Now, what I'd like to say about all of this is the more that you participate in StEER or get training from StEER or other key organizations like the Rapid Facility, the faster you can move up the levels and qualify for greater responsibilities within our organization. And so this gives people an opportunity to build up their capacity and expertise, but also to be mobilized in ways that best align with the level of experience that they have to date. So now that you understand a little bit about how we organize our members and our governance, let's move on to looking at how we actually respond to events and our response workflow. So virtual teams are an important part of everything we do at StEER, and we adopt a tiered response model that finds very explicit ways to engage individuals virtually in our efforts. At the first level, we're looking often at major hazard events that don't have a lot of ability to generate new knowledge, but they warrant some commentary because it still is a high intensity event. In this case, we might issue just an event briefing. It's about a 5 to 10 page document written by the leadership team to just summarize some of the key takeaways from the event, to reiterate things that we possibly already know that this event unfortunately underscored a need to emphasize. At the next level up, we would have a hazard event with potential to generate knowledge, so it's worth virtually gathering data. So what we would do is form our virtual assessment team, and you can see that happening right here, and they will start compiling publicly available information and synthesizing it into the first product, a preliminary virtual reconnaissance report. So that's the first release here on the timeline. Now, if the event shows some, promise in generating knowledge, not just potential, but we can see real promise there, we will elevate up then to a full response that engages a field team. And that field team will deploy and start collecting data. And that virtual team will remain active to look at the data that's coming in and support the authorship of a second report called an Early Access Reconnaissance Report, or EARR. That report comes out and is released, and now we have also a bunch of data that was collected in the field, which needs to be processed. We take all of our data and enrich it and run it through a quality control process. We call it the DEQC process. And that is led by a team of dedicated data librarians. That process can take months and eventually culminates in a data set that's released and published on DesignSafe to complete the timeline. Now, what we want to emphasize is during this long process, our data is actually, from the moment it's collected, made available, as you'll see later in this brief presentation, so that community can take advantage of the data even while it's being enriched and quality controlled. Now, as part of our new operational model in version 2 of StEER, we're trying to make our responses even more efficient and refined. So you'll see that we are still having these virtual teams as a level 1 response to a major event, but we are adding in a finer approach to when we mobilize field teams, starting first with a scout team that will collect panoramic imaging and other rapidly acquired data, and then moving forward with a field investigation that would take teams in more targeted up-close forensic assessments based on the leads that were generated from that level 2 field scout team. So these are some of the ways we're trying to streamline our operations and our efficiency in the next generation of StEER. Now, I will say that this entire experience in the pandemic, and most notably when we weren't able to deploy teams, really gave us the idea for this type of field scout team model. As you can see in the example here in the lower right corner, Hurricane Laura really challenged us to conceive ways to safely respond during the pandemic. And so what we did was we put out these small self-contained teams driving around in cars. They got over 600 miles of street view data. And then they were able to share that data back with engineers working safely in their homes who would virtually assess it and conduct the kind of performance assessment you would normally do with our mobile apps in the field. And they did this all remotely based on imagery. This really inspired us to use this new level 2 response model, these scout teams, to go out early, generate data quickly, and then allow that data to be processed and inform how we follow up with that level 3 response, if at all, for more targeted assessments. So then if we're going out into this kind of more targeted assessment, we might deploy any number of mission strategies. One of the common approaches shown in the top row here is to engage in a form of hazard gradient survey. And we've conducted this for both hurricanes as well as tornadoes. You can see the examples here. But the goal is that you select clusters of buildings to sample along the hazard intensity gradient so that you could basically use this information, for example, to develop fragilities describing the damage as a function of the variances in hazard intensity. In other instances, it's more appropriate to dive deep and focus in a more case study-based approach. So here in the second row, you can see 2 instances of that. A representative performance study may be warranted when we don't have much time to go back in, as was the case in the Palu earthquake and tsunami, in which case we might try to document a wide class of buildings and infrastructure through short surveys or vignettes of those different classes assembled together for that representative description of performance. Whereas in Puerto Rico, in the mission that was led by the John Bloom Center at Stanford in collaboration with StEER, we might do more targeted case studies because we have structures of particular value of interest. They might be associated with a strong motion monitoring program, in which case we want to go in and do very detailed photographic accounts and forensic reconstruction of their performance, again, because of their high value to further analysis. And then the bottom row, the response to Hurricane Dorian here, was an example of kind of a phased investigation that similarly used a scout team, followed by waves of larger interdisciplinary teams. So you can imagine Dorian is an early prototype of the level 2, level 3 model that we're now using. And that gave us a real appreciation for how that early scout could help guide what you would do in a more challenging situation, and then allow those larger teams to come in later stages to do more robust surveys of not only structural performance, but also documenting coastal and wind hazards with a wider array of equipment that they could bring in behind that more agile early team. And when we're coming in then, the hardware we use is vital to enable this kind of tiered approach. This slide summarizes, I would say, the 4 common mechanisms that we're using for data collection. I will reiterate that in particular, the scouts are heavily dependent on the use of these 360 imaging platforms, these types of street view technologies that allow that rapid imaging up and down streets. So that's going to be a key part of that level 2 response. And as we come back in at level 3 to do those more time-intensive data collection efforts, then we are going to rely on the mobile app to do a lot of more of that up-close forensic assessment. We're going to come in with unmanned aerial systems to get the overhead imagery that's critical, and we'll even do some select high-resolution imaging of particular structures that might be notable for a case study. When we have identified areas for that in-depth follow-up work, then we do often employ a mixed methodological approach, and this is where we might overlap different data collection strategies so that when we view them harmonized together, we'll get a richer description of both in-depth assessment as well as kind of context by getting the larger area surrounding each structure and thereby a way to broadly classify damage. So an example shown here is that if we find a cluster or neighborhood of interest for assessment, we might come in and immediately drive those street level panoramic imaging platforms up and down all the streets to get that baseline street level data, while going overhead to connect that with the aerial imagery that could be generated by unmanned aerial systems to generate structure from motion models of that little neighborhood. And in the meantime, we're moving on the ground, door to door, using an unbiased sampling strategy to come up to and up close a sampling of structures in this area to document a more detailed performance assessment using the mobile app, so that when we harmonize all of this, we get a really complete picture of what might have happened in a targeted geography. Now, talking for a moment about the app, which is a critical tool in those up-close forensic assessments, you can see here a summary of what our app entails. The app, which again is hosted on Fulcrum, you can see a screen capture here of what it looks like when you see all the pins in a given area. What this app does is it first captures a lot of rich information, everything from notes and parameters of the site to the building attributes, all of the structural attributes and features, and then down to component level damage assessments. The Fulcrum mobile app has been really critical because it allows us to do a very complex and detailed assessment in a manner that is still highly efficient and structured. And that's really critical to us because we have so many members participating, and therefore the app has been really vital to achieving the levels of standardization that we demand. And what we're able to do there is give that consistent structure, as you can see, but also sufficient flexibility in that the user can audio record narratives of things that they're observing. They can type free-form text to capture observations, and obviously they control the photographic evidence, which includes views from all sides of the structure, as well as up-close imagery of particularly notable component failures that might be essential to evaluating the damage on the structure. And all of this kind of very structured format really helps to reduce human error and consistently guide our assessments. Now, what's attractive is that each of these records that's generated with this rich information, including all of the embedded media, that's all coming into a single pin, a single geolocated record in the Fulcrum platform. And that can be interacted with on the mobile app, on their desktop web application, or just coming in and exporting it out in a common format, such as shapefiles or GeoJSONs, or even just an Excel database. And then you can bring it outside of Fulcrum and interact with it however you wish. And because the app synchronizes continuously with its backend, as long as cell phone coverage allows, then you've got a centralized database that people can be accessing while the field team is generating data, which is exceptionally valuable. And definitely reduces the burden in the backside when we start processing the data and preparing it for curation. So all of this is a huge asset to maintaining a highly efficient response. Now, one of the other ways that we improve the efficiency of the field response is before those teams go out, we will interrogate satellite imagery, social media, and everything else that our virtual team has compiled to try to pre-select targets, which could be specific structures, as you see here for Hurricane Dorian, or particular clusters of buildings or communities where we think there's something important to learn. Usually we're trying to get a representative sample across a diversity of structural typologies and occupancies, and this is then generated into a map that can be preloaded as a base map into our Fulcrum mobile platform. So that way the field assessor can see their position relative to targets in a more seamless way. We can also upload into Fulcrum additional base layers that might include high-resolution satellite imagery for that region. We can cache those so that doesn't strain them when they're out in the field, because they don't have a lot of bandwidth on those mobile devices. Now, while this slide might seem a bit overwhelming, it emphasizes one important thing, that the apps that we've constructed have a collection of fields, a large number of fields that are being gathered for each of the records that we create. What I want to emphasize is not all of this is on the burden or is burdening the field assessor. The ones that are encompassed in the green color are automatically generated by the app itself. Then the ones that are shown in orange and in red are areas that we direct the field assessors to focus on. We want to prioritize and have the app intelligently guide them to completing the fields that matter most when they're out there. That reduces the burden on them and allows them to cover more ground every day in their assessments. And then everything else that you see encompassed in, the kind of dark grayish purple color, all the other ones that are not lit up in green, orange, or red, those are all completed on the back end as part of our data enrichment and quality control process, so that the fast photos that they're collecting, as well as other forms of supplemental data, are allowing remote workers to then generate a lot more rich information about each of these buildings to complement that work that's being done in the field. So in looking at the kind of supplemental data that we do engage in that process, there's a number of sources that we tap into. Obviously, we start with the field data that was collected in our Fulcrum app, which we will then bring over and supplement with records available locally. That might include things like tax assessor data or permit data. And that gives us a lot of additional rich structural information that may not be visible or apparent from a field inspection. Other platforms provide additional information to allow that virtual assessor to dive in a little more deeply than just the still photos that came from the field. That includes a structure from motion model that we might generate from the unmanned aerial systems that were overhead. This is an example of that. We might get any number of other satellite and aerial imagery from different agencies and organizations that make that data available. We might also purchase high-resolution satellite imagery from a private sector provider. But all of these are important assets to get a full perspective. And as we said, we very commonly use those street-level panoramic platforms, so any of our virtual assessors can always walk up and down the streets literally to recreate the work of the field team in trying to assess the levels of damage. I'll also note importantly that a lot of this supplemental data is coming from our collaboration with the Rapid facility, using their hardware and their back-end processing to generate these rich views for our virtual teams to engage. Now, importantly, once you've got all of this data, it's got to get out to the research community, to practitioners and affected communities as soon as possible. So we have a couple of platforms that we engage in that process. Our street-level panoramas, or what you might know more traditionally as Street View, have been loaded into Google Maps, but we've more recently transitioned to a platform called Mapillary, because here we can have a dedicated page for all of StEER's routes, and those can be displayed against other open sourced panoramic imagery, which is a very kind of novel thing in comparison to what you see in Google Street View. We also, of course, have our Fulcrum data. That's, again, those on-the-ground app-based assessments that are conducted at close range. These are made public through that cooperation with what's called the Fulcrum community, which gives open access. Anybody can come in and see that data literally as it's coming in the field. Now, once the data has gone through its formal processing and data enrichment, quality control, it's going to come into DesignSafe and be curated as a formal project in the DesignSafe platform, where it's going to be preserved long-term as open data with a DOI. And so that's where all of our data finally resides, as do all of the reports that we generate through StEER. Each of those is generated as a PDF and gets its own project space with a full DOI that will give long-term access to anyone interested in learning more about those events. So in closing, now that I've taken you through our governance model and our response workflows, I'd like to close with just a few remarks about who we are and what we hope to do. Again, StEER is an organization that was formed with the goal of really advancing the ways in which we generate knowledge from disaster data. and speed the learning after a natural hazards event. The way we do so as a team is we want to get in there early. We have centralized our coordination with strategic objectives that get our team out swiftly and give them these workflows that we believe are very effective. And that efficiency has allowed us to coordinate pretty expansive responses that engage both virtual members and our field members. And I really want to emphasize that virtual reconnaissance has been vital to deepening both our capacity and our efficiency, but also to broadening participation, because you don't have to go out to the field for 3 to 4 days to have value to StEER. And I would hope that we've been impactful in doing so. We strive to create consistent and high quality data and make that available as a community asset that has value to drive continued research and development, and is critical, again, to helping to kind of bring full circle that data to knowledge life cycle that occurs every time one of these events strikes a community. So with that, I wanted just to remind you all the ways to stay engaged and involved with StEER. Always, feel free to come to StEER Network's website, where you can see what we're working on and what events we're responding to. It's also the place to find all of our resources. If you don't happen to be a StEER member yet, you can join at that website and complete a brief membership form. And once you accept our guidelines and in terms of participation, you will be added to all of our Slack channels and Google Drives to begin participating. Once you're there, remember that our StEER channel on Slack has announcements, especially when we're going to mobilize for an event. Those are also rolled out via email. And also remember that you can always contact us by email at admin@steer.network. And with that, I'd like to close this video with just appreciation, first of all, for the National Science Foundation with its generous support of StEER's efforts, as well as our colleagues at all the other EERs who have really helped through the Converge node to speed learning and growth across all of us. That knowledge sharing has been vital to improving our ability to respond to these events. Our partnership with the Rapid Facility and Design Safe CI teams has been especially fruitful in creating the workflows you've seen in this video, as has the cooperation of Spatial Networks and their generosity in making the Fulcrum Community Platform available to StEER at no charge. We also have a wide network of organizations and agencies in the disaster and natural hazard space who have been really vital as they respond to and learn from these events themselves. They've been great in bringing StEER into the fold and sharing intel, and we've hoped and worked to do the same. And finally, I want to just thank all of our members. They voluntarily participate in StEER, and they make great sacrifices to do what I believe is truly important work. And so we just want to recognize them and their institutions for so generously sharing their time and talent to hope that we all can build greater resilience through this type of impactful reconnaissance. Thank you.